Have you ever been convicted of an offense? Yes or no? That's the question that had been weighing upon Anthony's mind as he hovered in the back of a government center's basement room some 6 years ago. Yes, he would have to answer on his job applications, the last 13 to be exact. Yes, on his rental application. Yes, on his college application. Yes, on his loan application. Yes, yes, yes. How would you respond? If, like me, you can say no. You haven't been convicted of an offense. However, if you said yes, like Anthony, know that you are one of the 65 to 100 million people in the United States with a criminal record. Let me tell you how I met Anthony. Several years ago, I left my job in public defense to work in public policy. I thought that if I could change the laws that were so acutely affecting my clients, I could be a better advocate. I took a job at a legal nonprofit in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and my focus was on criminal records. We held expungement clinics in the basement of that government center in a small windowless room. In this space, men, women, and youth, all poor, predominantly people of color, would line up for hours waiting for the opportunity to speak to an attorney, someone who may be able to help them wipe that slate clean. One night, I'm sure the sun had long since set, when in walked our last participant. Anthony was tall, thin, black, and clearly distraught. As he hesitantly walked toward me, he pulled from his back pocket a copy of his criminal record, a printout he had received from a computer terminal 2 flights up. I was nervous to open this. What could his record contain that would cause him this much stress? A theft, and a minor one at that. I let out a short laugh of relief. Even if the court doesn't expunge the matter, I said, it's not like your life is over. And with that, Anthony began to cry. He told me that earlier that day he had in fact tried to take his own life. You see, what was just a theft to me, to Anthony, was a lost job. It was missed housing payments. It was skipped meals. It was door after door slammed in his face. It was the loss of respect from his friends and family, the loss of a sense of self, the loss of hope. Around this same time, I had been traveling all around the state, speaking to legislators and landlords, employers and licensing boards, and imploring them to give my clients a second chance. Time and again I heard, you can't trust a con. Once a criminal, always a criminal. Those words came back to me as I looked at Anthony, and I thought, how many times had I taken something that wasn't mine? Sure, I'd considered my own criminality before, but not like this. I hadn't really thought about what life would be like, living in the shadow of a criminal record under the suffocating stigma of having been caught. What would life be like if I didn't have the luxury to forget? 1 in 4 people in the United States has a criminal record. And that's a conservative estimate, by the way. I contend that 4 in 4 have a criminal history. For the past few years, I've been traveling all around the United States, interviewing people like me, the 75% of people who have criminal histories but no record, and asking them, what have you had the luxury to forget? Tonight, I want to share with you some of those stories. Some are going to be petty, some are serious. Some happened decades ago, others a bit more recently. In doing so, I hope to provide for you a new and personal way of examining the deep effects of the juvenile and criminal justice systems upon a person and the disparate effects of those systems upon poor people, people of color, and Indigenous people across the U.S. But first, I want to make sure we're all on the same page. This is a graph made with data taken from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, and it shows the U.S. state and federal prison population between 1925 and 2013. You can see that we haven't always been an incarceration nation. And some 4 decades ago, we began the deliberate and regrettable march toward this, the caging of more than 1.5 million people. Wars on drugs and poverty and mental illness, private prisons, 3 strikes rules, mandatory minimum sentencing, and concentrated policing in minority communities are just a few of the many policies and practices that have led to this $80 billion a year mass incarceration, mass disaster. Now, what is additionally concerning is what happens to people when they're no longer in the system, when they're back in the communities trying to get on with life. That's when a new, insidious form of punishment begins. When people find that they may not be locked out, they're not locked up, but are now locked out of jobs and school and housing and countless other opportunities to move on and move up. Now, before we delve into the world of collateral consequences or those lifelong effects of a criminal record, let's turn back to this graph. As I said, it shows the U.S. state and federal prison population. Just as importantly is what it doesn't show. It doesn't, for example, show the millions of people who are in county and parish jails, those on immigration holds, on civil commitments, or kids in juvenile detention. They are not shown here on this graph. It doesn't show the millions of people who are on probation and parole, their liberties curtailed under the thumb of the criminal justice system, just not spending their nights behind bars. They are not shown here on this graph. And it doesn't show the tens of millions of people like Anthony who are locked out, who are held underwater, unable to come up for air. They are not shown here on this graph. And just as importantly, it doesn't show the nearly 3 million sons and daughters, the countless brothers and sisters, mothers and fathers, spouses and partners, and greater family and community members who can all be profoundly affected when someone is taken out of the home and then not allowed back in. They are not shown here on this graph. So what may initially appear to be a tsunami of humanity ready to crash upon our shores, you realize it's just a drop in the overall greater ocean of a crisis. That crisis is not born equally across the country. For example, from the Sentencing Project, Black males born in 2001 face a lifetime likelihood of imprisonment of 1 in 3. For white women, it's 1 in 111. Now, that's not to say that white women aren't committing crimes, right? But we're not who you see, proportionately speaking, in our criminal justice system. Note that rates of offending do not come close to explaining these disparities. Looking at just the war on drugs, for example, arguably one of the greatest contributing factors to our current carceral crisis. Black and white individuals use and sell drugs at roughly the same rates. Yet black individuals are far more likely to be stopped, searched, arrested, charged, prosecuted, and convicted for engaging in drug-related activity than are whites. Now, in addition to people of color, poor people, people with mental health and chemical dependency concerns, are likewise disproportionately affected. And yet, we do little to address these issues once someone's in the system. In fact, we do a lot to exacerbate the very problems. Prison is warehousing with trauma. With too few exceptions, meaningful opportunities for treatment and education, they're non-existent. Saddled with criminal records, people leave prison making second chances or firsts exceedingly rare. I said I've been collecting these stories over the years, and they range in severity, these stories of the people who have gotten away with it. From quite serious, like this student and his aggravated robbery, to and this pastor who brought a loaded gun on an international flight, to relatively innocuous, like this gentleman who had an open bottle that's carrying a beer from one house party to the next. Petty theft was the next one down. That's failure to return a library book, which is an offense, by the way. The next one down was public urination. This gentleman now has a contract to work with the Department of Defense, some of the highest security clearance in the nation. Had he been caught, he would find difficulty getting a job at a gas station. I know because many of my clients were denied those very jobs for these very records. Likewise, the responses to the recollections of past transgressions are also varied, like this gentleman who told me about a time he had taken his uncle's hunting rifle out to college with him. One drunken night, he decided to liberate the quarters within a double-posted parking meter. A single shot went right through the locking mechanism, letting loose $40 worth of quarters. He calls it his $40 shot, and he laughed throughout the entire interview. Some people recognize not just the luxury to forget, but the luxury to not regret, while others are deeply sorry. This woman told me about a time when she was working as a barista. She said she used to pad her tips with bills from the till. As she told me this, the tears streamed down her face. She said, "I cannot imagine what life would be like now had I been labeled a thief then." I've heard from law enforcement officers who reflect upon the weight of the mistakes that they've made, and time and again from people who recognize that crime is an event in a life course, not a static characteristic of one's being. And then I've heard some truly heartbreaking stories. Like the gentleman for whom I took this photograph. He said he struggled to survive his teens. After one regrettable Saturday morning, he could have been charged and convicted with a first-degree assault for the benefit of a gang. He wasn't. He graduated from high school. He got a scholarship to go to college. He went on to graduate school and now has a PhD in biophysics. His future was not foreclosed. And I've heard so many stories from people who engaged in drug-related activity on college campuses, like this gentleman who said he donated some of his FAFSA funds to help finance a drug ring. He wanted a girlfriend. Or this woman who said that she sold weed to frat bros and football players so that she could get a "hey, what's up" in the hallway. She said she was sick of feeling invisible. And then there are some stories that I just can't believe we're still talking about in 2017. This woman told me about a time just a few years ago when her husband was diagnosed with a particularly aggressive and terminal form of cancer. In the last few months of his life, she said his body became so riddled with pain that he could no longer pick up a pencil or shampoo his own hair. This man who the year before had been an active Marine, ostensibly at the peak of his physical career, could now no longer bathe himself. She said the only thing that could assuage that pain was pot. Now, she had asthma, so he couldn't smoke it. So instead, she put the pot in the butter and the brownies, and together they would eat it. And she said that when they did, he could uncramp his hand enough to hold hers. He died. Her life stopped. She doesn't remember what she did with the pot. Maybe she ate it. She didn't think so. Maybe her friends did. That's more likely. Maybe she threw it away. It didn't matter. What mattered was that her husband had just died. "Is that a story you think you can use?" she said. And I told her about a phone call we had received at that legal nonprofit. There was an elder Ojibwe woman who had been living with her only son, a man in his 40s, when he was diagnosed with a particularly aggressive and terminal form of cancer. In the last few months of his life, his body became so riddled in pain that she said it's like she would sit with just a shell of his former self. The only thing that could assuage that pain was pot. Now, she didn't have asthma, so he straight up smoked it. And when he did, she said it's like her baby was back with her again. He died. Her life stopped. She didn't move his work boots from the back door or toss his toothbrush from the bathroom sink, and she didn't throw away the baggies of pot that were in the freezer. Some time went by and a search warrant was executed on her home. There had been allegations she was warehousing drugs. Police tore apart the place, found the pot in the freezer. She was arrested, charged, and later convicted with a felony-level possession of controlled substances. This woman is 72 years old, has no prior criminal record, and because of a felony record, is now living on the streets. We Are All Criminals is about the human cost of mass incarceration, about the human cost of mass criminalization. We have all violated the law, but more importantly, we are all human, and some of us, perhaps 1 in 4 of us, may be in need of a second chance. But make no mistake, this project is also a commentary on the disparate impact of our nation's policies, policing, and prosecution. Many, not all, but many of the participants have benefited from belonging to a race and class that is not overrepresented in our criminal justice system, and some of the participants have been pretty straight up about that. I grew up in a very affluent town, he said. It was the kind of place where it was easy not to have contact with police. Of the few interactions I had were very respectful and innocuous. A tap on the shoulder, a suggestion to go home. understand that not everyone is afforded that same presumption of innocence. For many people in America, especially Black men and youth, their mere existence is seen as always already criminal. Now, while you're thinking about the stories of the people who got away with it, consider the lives, the narratives of the people who are serving time right now, or suffering under the weight of a record right now, many for the same behavior. There are millions to choose from. If the criminal justice system was designed by people that believe that they might one day be involved, he said, then we would have justice. So I ask you tonight, what's your story? What would your chalkboard say? What would life be like for you if you had to check yes? One of your professors, Denise Woodall, has been asking students how people in prison or those with criminal records should be treated. Should people in prison receive 2 or 3 meals a day? Should they be allowed to study behind bars, work upon release, live near you? After collecting these responses, she then asks students to reflect upon their own criminality. Consider what life would be like had you been prosecuted, had you been punished, had you been labeled a criminal. She then returns to those first questions once more. She tells me that more than 50% of the time, for example, students who had at first said that people behind bars should receive only 2 meals a day, now change their answers to 3, upon realizing that they themselves could have been the ones denied dinner for the next 8 years. We Are All Criminals is about closing that empathy chasm. This is a call for reason, for mercy, for equity, and an acknowledged ownership in the problem as well as the solution, so that soon, someday, when Anthony, that's him there, opens a sheet of paper, a page that's used to define his character, he finds not thief, but father, caregiver, nurse, speaker of multiple languages, survivor of genocide, volunteer coach, and avid reader, a man not defined by his worst moment, but by his true worth, with the luxury to forget and with the opportunity to be forgiven. A man not tethered to his past, but wholly able to live in the present and to dream of a future. Thank you.